Hello, Broken Arrow. This is the Vibe BA, and we are driving BA today, albeit from the studio here at City Hall with Engineering Construction Director Charlie Bright. Typically, we have you out in the car, and you're driving around, you're telling folks about the different improvements, but you had a fantastic idea to actually sit down and talk about the project life cycle. Why was this important to you?
I think it's important because we get a lot of, we just get a lot of calls, general comments from the community is like, hey, when are we going to fix this? When are we going to do this? And a lot of those things are in the process. I would say the roads that we hear the most frequently from the citizens about are all being worked on. And we say that and we tell them, but you don't see immediate change. And so it's kind of hard to believe that sometimes, maybe if you're a citizen. But the reality is these road projects are complicated. And on average, they probably take us 5 to 6 years to complete, and there's a reason for that. It's not just going slow, it's just a process. And so I think it's important people understand what that process looks like and understand when it's being worked on. It's like we're getting there and we know it's important and we go as fast as we can and we're trying to get these roads improved because we know it takes time out of our citizens' days. It's the impact is significant.
Yeah, you talk about current construction projects, being able to actually see work happening. And right now we have a pretty significant widening project going on a mile there, Houston Street between Garnett and Olive. But it's taken a long time to get to this point. We started this in around Labor Day of 2024, but this process actually started about 8 years earlier. Started with that as far as just the discussion and talk about which of the road improvement projects are going to be included in the 2018 general obligation bond. So you got the securing of the project funding, designing of the improvements, environmental clearance, right-of-way acquisitions, utility line relocations, and then finally construction. Let's go back to that first one and securing project funding. This is one of those things that we just can't go to the bank and get the money?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. We've, in a practical sense, we probably started that project about 8 years ago in a planning stage. And as you said, the vote for the general obligation bond was in 2018, but we had to do some initial planning to even make it a project in 2017. So really the idea of this becoming a project happened in 2017. We went to the voters in 2018, said, hey, this is the project we want to complete. We need the funding. And luckily, our voters with overwhelming support approved that bond and gave us the funding. One misconception probably by a lot of people is when they vote to give us the money, we have a check in our hand that day. And that's not the reality. The way our bonds here at the City of Broken Arrow work, we still collect our bonds on an annual basis based off property taxes. So the voters approve it, and that gives us the opportunity to sell bonds on an annual basis. Then our leadership will decide which projects and which bonds we sell per year. On average, I would say we sell between 20 and 30 million in bonds a year, but the bond had $200 million worth of improvements. So basically, we have every project in a line for when they're going to come, and ultimately our council makes a decision of when we're going to sell a particular project. So we have to wait for the funding for a project before we can even get started on the design or on the right-of-way acquisition, utilities, or anything else. But once that funding comes, then now we're starting the process of that 5-year window of how long it's going to take us to get to construction.
And then when you get into that funding, you have to think of things as far as the costs on some of the different things, and we'll get to them, but like designing improvements. Because to hire an engineering consultant firm to come out, they're going to want their cut. They're going to want to, they need to be paid as well. How much does a design cost? Let's just say, let's go with Houston. You may not, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, you may not know, but you can probably give it an approximate. The Houston widening project between Garnett and Olive, about how much did the design cost for that?
I don't know the exact numbers. I think the bid price for that project was approximately $6 million. I
think it was 5.7.
And typically a design from a consultant will run 8 to 10% of your construction cost. So just using rough math there, the design on a project like that, and this was 4 to 5 years ago, the construction has gone up. But a design on a project like that probably would run $500,000 to $600,000 a few years ago. So it's not an inexpensive cost to just get the design going on the front end, but it takes a lot of work for them to complete that design. It's a lot of man hours going into just making it operable.
And that doesn't account for the right-of-way, for the utility line relocation, and then the overall construction as well too. So design improvements. So whenever you're talking about costs, is there a big difference between taking a 2-lane roadway and making it 3, 4, and 5 lane? How does that process work?
Yeah, so typically there's a lot of needs across our community. Talk to citizens. Every citizen wants a different road. Every citizen wants, the road in front of their neighborhood fixed, their actual neighborhood fixed. In an ideal world, every road we have in town would be 5 lanes. In fact, I think I see Facebook comments saying, "Why don't you widen every road in 5 lanes?" If the funding was there, we would love to. But the reality is we have a very limited pot of money that we can do improvements with for the citizens. And so we try to prioritize which jobs get that money based off what the actual data shows and what the needs are. We take traffic counts on an annual basis. We get the data. We run that through traffic analysis. We find what streets and corridors have our longest delay times. And once we know where the biggest impacts are, we prioritize those projects. Some areas have a decent volume of vehicles, but maybe not super high, but you're on a 2-lane road with a small intersection and it's causing significant delays. But from a traffic analysis perspective, we know that since the volumes aren't as high as maybe your main arterials, we know if you add a turn lane and you improve the turn lanes at the intersections, those delay times go away. And so we look at all that, and in those situations, it makes sense that we just widen a road to 3 lanes versus taking it to 4 or 5, because it can save us millions of dollars, and that allows us to prioritize those millions of dollars to the other needs that we have in the community. So yes, in a perfect world, we'd love to create the 5 lanes everywhere. In the world that we live in, we try to prioritize our dollars to limit the delays that we have all across town.
So I'm glad you brought up the traffic counts, and that takes up a lot of time because you're having to look at all this data, historical data, but then you're also having to look ahead too and look at those areas for economic development opportunities, community development with housing additions and that sort of thing. How important are those turning movements? Because one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit is the intersections and keeping that traffic flowing so that it's efficient, it's quick, it's safe for people. But turning movements, from what I understand, that's the real issue.
Turning movements are pretty much the issue. It's not one of the issues, it is pretty much the main issue. Ultimately, if you think logically about traffic and driving across town, where do your delays happen? Your delays happen at the intersections, or your delays happen on a 2-lane road, 4-lane road when you have people waiting to turn left and they can't do it because the traffic volumes are high. Very, very rarely, and I can't think of any in our community off the top of my head, are your delays due to the capacity of the actual lanes of the road itself. There is a point where a road breaks down if you just have too many vehicles trying to get on one road. Typically, in our system, we don't have a lot of roads break down because of capacity. We have the delays because those vehicles ultimately can't get through the intersection up ahead. And so we do take that into account. We look at it a lot, and we try to prioritize dollars as much as we can to go towards intersections and to go towards turn lanes, because we know that those dollars make the most significant impact to limit the delays that our citizens have.
So that kind of hits on the design. After that, then we're looking at environmental clearance, and I think it's probably important to ask this question. Are you waiting for each one of these phases to be completed before you move on to the next one, or are they working concurrently?
Some of them we have to wait. It's kind of a process, but we do as much as we can concurrently. For example, environmental clearance is one we have to wait until the design is done. We don't do an environmental clearance on every project we do. We have federal funding involved in, I'd estimate, 40 to 50% of our projects. And when we take the federal money, there is federal regulations tied to that. And one of those regulations is we have to do environmental clearances. But we send that off to the state of Oklahoma, who ultimately administers the environmental clearance. And they won't start that until we have a fully designed project. Which makes sense. If you're going to check what our environmental impact is, you need to know the limits of what our work is going to be. And so we have to finish that design before we're going to go to that next step of environmental. And it's kind of a similar situation with utility relocations. ultimately those people the utility providers don't want to start relocating or planning their relocations until they know where our road's going to be exactly. And so we do have to finish that. I'd say the one thing we do concurrently as much as we can is right-of-way. Again, we need to know most of the design, but there are some opportunities. We know what ultimate right-of-way usually is, and there are some opportunities to go acquire what we believe to be ultimate right-of-way, maybe before we finish the design and get going in that process.
I want to come back to the right-of-way and utility line relocation, but staying with environmental clearance. We were just talking before we started this podcast about the Houston project between Lynn Lane and County Line Road. There's some challenges there on either side of that roadway that are going to take some time as far as environmental is concerned. It's going to lengthen the amount of time before we get that clearance. You want to talk about that and just some of those challenges, the challenges that are there?
Absolutely. So that's a great example of a project that is complicated and it's going to take time. The voters approved that project as one project, actually, from Lynn Lane to Highway 51. We have decided since then to split it into two projects, one from Lynn Lane, Houston Street from Lynn Lane to County Line, and a second one, Houston Street from County Line to Highway 51. Our reasoning for doing that is exactly what you just talked about, the challenges that happen between Lynn Lane and County Line. It's going to have some delays. It's going to take us some time to get there. But those same challenges don't exist from County Line to Highway 51. So we decided to split the project. We're moving as quick as we can on the County Line to Highway 51 portion. And ultimately, we're going to go to construction on that portion before we do on the rest. To the challenges that happen on the Lynn Lane to County Line section. If you're familiar with the area, you drive the area, you know that it's a two-lane road. It's not in great shape. When you're driving out there, it's kind of narrow. You get trees on both sides, but then as you get closer to the eastern end, you actually get to where you have a channel, a stream on both sides of the road. In our world, we call that stream's actually what we call a blue line stream, which means it's on federal maps, the USGS federal maps, and it means it is a federally regulated stream. So we do have a lot of challenges. To design around that, if we impact those streams, we're going to have to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to get permissions to do whatever we're doing inside that regulated area. And it's going to be very challenging to build a road without getting into those streams. If you just drive, you see how close they are to the roadway. And then, as you stated, once we get through the design, we're going to have to then go into that environmental clearance portion with the state of Oklahoma and federal. And they're going to look very heavily in the environmental clearance at our impact again on the streams. So we expect a lot of delays, first dealing with permitting at the Army Corps of Engineers, and then more when we go through our environmental phases following that up. But that's also why we felt it was important to split this project up, because we don't need to delay the other half of the project. We're going to go as quick as we can through that process, but those things just take time.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think that's one of those things I didn't understand until I started working in municipal governance, is that the city has to put in a permit for these sorts of things too. And so we have to ask the Army Corps of Engineers if we can have permission to do these sorts of things. So it's not us taking our time. It's just you have intergovernmental agencies that are having to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say the city and my team, we actually make every effort we can to follow all permitting requirements, even our local ones that are ourselves. If we put it on a private developer, we try to follow it ourselves. There's some gray area there where we don't pay our own permitting fees because it's just us paying ourselves, but we follow all the same rules. But then especially once you get beyond our ordinances and you move on to state law, federal law, we have to follow everything that every other private business would have to follow. We have to go through those permitting processes, and we have to wait our turn in line with those entities. And so there's challenges, and like anybody knows, federal law it's difficult sometimes. And there's a lot of strings attached when it comes to federal law, and so it takes time for us to get through that.
And when you talk about those federal dollars and them coming into the state, ODOT must administer those when it comes to these roadway improvements. How does that impact the bidding process and the management process of the project when it finally does get to construction?
Yeah, due to all the regulations that are tied to federal dollars, it makes a significant impact to the schedule and sometimes the cost of a project. You have what you call Davis-Bacon wages, you have Buy American, and then you have the environmental studies that are all tied to federal dollars. And as you mentioned, ODOT is the administrator. The Oklahoma Department of Transportation is the administrator of those federal dollars. So if we were to bid a project without federal dollars, there's a lot less regulation tied to it, and there's a lot more control we have of that schedule. So we can typically get a project out a little bit faster, and then we have direct oversight of the project a little bit cheaper. When ODOT takes over control of a project, they have their own processes and standards, and they're dealing with communities all across the state, not just ours. So they have a letting schedule, what they call a bid letting schedule, and they have their own processes. So when we finish a project, we'll turn it over to ODOT, the state of Oklahoma, have them bid it, and they'll get on it. But then they also hire third-party inspectors versus it being city inspectors, and so it's just a much longer process because now instead of just following our standards, you're following our standards, you're following the state of Oklahoma standards, and then you're trying to follow federal regulations. And overall, it just takes time.
And so while some of this is going on, your team is also working on right-of-way acquisitions. What exactly is that?
Yeah, right-of-way acquisitions is probably one of the hardest challenges of widening a road. So if you go back in history of the state of Oklahoma, you look at every arterial road that we have, which is arterial means the square grid, 51st, 61st, 71st, Olive, Aspen, Elm, Lynn Lane. You look at those arterial roads. The state of Oklahoma made an agreement with the tribes many, many years ago to give us what we call statutory right-of-way. So every one of those arterial roads has statutory right-of-way. I believe statutory for us is approximately 24.25 feet on both sides of the center line of the road, which means you take the center of the road, you go 24.25 feet either direction. That's how much land is technically the city of Broken Arrows. Now, the average lane of a road is 12 feet. If I'm going to go to 4 lanes or 5 lanes, by the time I get to that 4th or 5th lane, I'm outside that 24 feet that's mine.
Easily.
Yeah. And so we have what we call ultimate right-of-way, which is typically 50 to 60 feet. A lot of times it's 50 feet from the center line of the road. And so when we widen a road from that 2 lanes up to 5 lanes, we got to go get ultimate right-of-way, which means we need the other 25.75 feet beyond what we have. Well, that's private property. Somebody owns that. So we have to go and engage those property owners, tell them what we're doing, explain the benefit to the public, and ultimately acquire that property from them. We get appraisals. We always offer to pay fair market value, but it's a process. Some property owners are like, hey, I'm excited, we're widening this road, and they work very easily with us, and we come to a deal, and buy the property. Others, aren't in favor of it. They don't want the road widened, or they don't want to give up their property. And so they're going to make the process harder and longer and try to negotiate with us much longer or flat out refuse selling us the property. And again, once we finish the design, we move into that right-of-way stage, this can just delay a project. If I have a property owner that digs in their feet and doesn't want to work with us, sometimes it could take us 6 months up to a year to figure out one property, and that will delay the whole project if that happens.
And when you talk about property, are you talking about a person's entire acreage that they have, or is it just what we need for the improvements? So
there are some very rare circumstances where we will purchase an entire property, and usually that has to do with the proximity of the home to the roadway, how close it is and all that. And so there are some rare circumstances where we bought entire houses. And again, we negotiate, we pay fair market value for that whole property. But I would say greater than 90% of the time, we're talking about just that portion that we need at the front of the land, which is typically about 25 feet of property at the front. Most of the times when you're talking arterial roads, that's not residential. It's an agricultural area or a commercial business or whatever else, and we work to take that land. That's just what we need there at the front.
We hear words like condemnation and eminent domain. Is that the same thing as right-of-way?
Those are a tool of right-of-way. Okay. We make an attempt to negotiate and pay fair market value to everybody that we talk with. Ultimately, the state government says that we do have the power of what people know as eminent domain, which means if we can show a public benefit, we can take the property. We can force the taking if somebody does not want to work with us. People will
But
often.
when you say that, they're still being compensated fair market
Absolutely.
value.
There is still a process and compensated. So a lot of times there is a misconception that, a lot of people don't want to negotiate with us or work with us, and that we use eminent domain a lot here at the City of Broken Arrow. That's our tool of last resort. I don't have the exact numbers, but I want to say it's between 80 and 90% of property owners negotiate with us, and we come to a mutual agreement that they're going to all sell us the property. We always start with an appraisal on what we consider fair market value, and we encourage the property owner to go get their own appraisals or make counter offers, and we negotiate of what we think is a fair deal to that property owner and fair to the taxpayers of Broken Arrow, because ultimately it is the taxpayers paying for that property. But as you said, eminent domain is one tool. Condemnation and eminent domain kind of mean the same thing. Condemnation is ultimately the process of us implementing eminent domain. So when we are unable to make a deal with a property owner and we can show that the infrastructure is a benefit to the public as a whole, then we will go through the condemnation process for road widenings if needed. Ultimately, but as you mentioned, through that process, they still get compensated at fair market value. It just takes it out of our hands and out of the property owner hands, and it puts it in the hands of the courts. We go to a court, a judge will assign 3 commissioners, which are ultimately individuals that are in the real estate business. They know property values. Those commissioners will come to a hearing, and they will hear our side of what we need, what the project is for, and everything else. They'll hear whatever the property owner has to say about the value of the property, the way this impacts their property or impacts their use of the property. And then ultimately the commissioners will make a ruling on what they feel the fair market value is of that property. And then once that ruling happens, we can pay what the judgment is, and then ultimately that property becomes ours. But again, it's based off of what a third-party individual sets as the fair market value for that property. And those people have no ties to us or the City of Broken Arrow. They're truly just representatives that are third parties that are there to do the best they can.
Utility line relocations. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. These are some of the lines that are underneath the roadway. First of all, why do we need, or not underneath the roadway, but underneath the ground next to the roadway, why do these need to be relocated?
Yeah, so this goes back to the discussion of statutory right-of-way. So historically, utilities have come into an area. When we go way back in history, they come into an area. They want to build out their infrastructure to provide services to the city, but they want to do it in a cheap manner. So they get what they call right-of-way permits from us, which basically is an agreement that they can provide their utilities to our citizens and do that through our right-of-way.
And these could be gas, electric, fiber, that sort of thing.
It's everybody. Any service you got coming to your house, they're in our right-of-way usually. And as you said, that's your AT&Ts, your Windstreams, Cox. It's all data. It's PSO and electric. It's ONG. It's now new fiber lines. We got a bunch of new fiber companies coming in, but all the services that are provided, a lot of times they're in our right-of-way. And that was just because, historically that was a cheaper way for them to build out their system than to go get their own private land. Where it makes it a challenge is when we're widening a road. We talked about statutory right-of-way being 24 feet. Well, if we're taking up 12 feet of 24, then that other 12 is full of those utilities. Now I want to fill that 12 with pavement. I want to widen my pavement to be 24, 30 feet in each direction. I'm completely covering those utilities. We don't cover pavement over the utilities because they need maintenance a lot. And if I go and put pavement over it, we're going to be shutting down that lane of road all the time while they're digging up our road to fix utilities. So before we widen any road, we work with every utility provider to get their systems out of the way. Ultimately, if it really depends on where it's located based off who pays for it. If their entire system is inside our right-of-way, then basically the law reads, hey, we let you be here as a privilege, and when the time comes and we need you to move, you're going to move at your cost. So if they're just truly sitting in our right-of-way, they pay to move themselves, and they just get out of our way, and then we'll build our road. Sometimes a utility provider will have their own easement beyond our right-of-way. So we have the 24 feet, they might have another 20 feet beyond it. Well, now we need to widen the road, we need to move our right-of-way through their easement and build. In those situations, they've already paid for their own dedicated easement, they paid to put their line in there. Now we're relocating them for our benefit, not theirs, and we end up having to pay to relocate those situations. So how the process shakes out is really unique to every situation, where the line's located, but it's ultimately a process. Every single road, I would say on average, has at least 5 to 6 utilities in the way, and so I need every one of those utility companies to work with me and start relocating before I can ever get to construction.
And now we're at construction.
Yep.
Let's say that we've gotten through all of this, those 5 previous phases, and now we're at construction. But yet before we can actually go out and any of the road be turned up, we're statutorily, we are obligated to put it out for bid. Is that correct? Talk about that process.
Yeah, so Title 61 and state statute, basically it's known as the Competitive Bidding Act. It says that, we will be, any government work will be open for fair competition to the public. So there's a process, and it takes time like everything else. There's a process that says we will advertise in the newspapers. We will make it known that anybody can come bid this work. There's certain criteria they have to meet, but it's an open bid. And we're required to leave that out for 21 days to bid it. Oftentimes we leave it out 28, so it takes a month just to get bids. We follow through with that process, and state law will say once we get bids, we will award the bids to the lowest responsible bidder. It is sometimes misconceived in the public that we always take the low bid. I will say usually we take the low bid because usually the low bid is responsible, but state law does actually say lowest responsible, and no weight is given to low or responsible. So if, say, your number 2 bidder is considerably more responsible in our eyes than number 1, we can go with number 2 because, we feel like they're more qualified to do the work. But most of the contractors that work in the area are all good contractors, and we don't have many we would consider non-responsive, so a lot of times we do take that low bid. But once we get through that, then we have to do contract signings, and we have to get bonds, insurance, all that in place. Many of those things can take another month or 2. And then we finally set up our kickoff meeting, and we'll set a notice to proceed, which is the first day of construction. So even once everything else is done and we're ready to start construction, there's still probably a process of 3 to 4 months before you ever see the first piece of equipment show up out on a roadway. And sometimes that's not always understood. If the public reach out to us, they'll say, when are you building my road? And we'll say, hey, we're bidding it in May. And then they reach out in May and say, why aren't you building my road? Well, we're bidding it and we're getting there. But there's still a process before you actually see a contractor show up.
And then one of the things I've noticed with the engineering construction team that you all started doing with more frequency here of late is public meetings with residents of areas that could be impacted by these. Why are you doing those?
It's really twofold. One, citizens are just curious sometimes when you're about to start something. They want to know what's going on. They want to know how it impacts them. So one, it's to kind of satisfy the curiosity, give people the opportunity to just know what's going on. But 2, and probably the more important one to me, is I definitely push my team to hold public meetings when we're going to be impactful to a neighborhood or an area. If it's just a general project on an arterial that doesn't really have a major impact on a specific neighborhood or anything else, we may not have one. But if we are going to be inside a neighborhood or blocking access to a neighborhood or anything else, we offer everybody the opportunity to come look at the project, hear about it, meet our team. Ultimately, we want individuals to know how we're going to impact them during construction. It's a citizen's choice whether they show up or not and they want to talk to us, but we want to give them the opportunity to know what's going on. We try to send letters to their houses to let them know we're doing it. I think we've tried to use the Nextdoor app in the past to let them know we're going. We may try to target Facebook a little bit more in the future of how we're holding these meetings, and we're talking about putting up some signage in neighborhoods to let them know. But the ultimate goal is to give them an opportunity to understand how construction is going to impact their lives while it happens, and to give them an opportunity to ask questions about what's happening. And one of the big benefits of coming is we just give you the business card of the people that are doing the work. You know, sometimes we're working in the neighborhood, we are going to impact your driveway, or we're going to impact your sidewalk, your yard, whatever. And if something doesn't seem right, whatever, and you're like, I need to call the city, who do I call? Well, if you show up to the public meeting, we'll give you the business card of the guy to call. You're always welcome to call your leadership, your representative, your elected officials, or whatever else. But we'll give you the business card of the staff member that's going to be there on the job site. You call him, he'll know what's going on, and hopefully can fix it in a timely manner.
Yeah, let's go full circle here, because we started out talking about the Houston Street widening project there between Garnett and Olive. On all of our capital improvement roadway projects, we've got the nice big signs that say, you know, progress is promised, but there's always a date on them. Like on that Houston one, it says 2018, but this started in 2024. You want to elaborate just on that date and what that means? Yeah,
that's our way of trying to remind the citizens of the funding and reminding the citizens of, you know, how we get these projects done and when they voted on it. You know, ultimately at the end of the day, 2018 is when the citizens voted that they wanted this project done. And everything we talked about today is the process and the life cycle it takes us to get to the end. But the citizens told us in 2018 they wanted to get it done. And now we're saying on the back end, we've done what we told you we would do. And this is us here sitting here completing it. We know, and we hear it all the time, you know, I wish it didn't take that long, and I'll say we wish it didn't either.
Same.
But it's the process that it is. And once we get it past the citizens to say, yes, we want this, and the funding is provided to do it, we're going to get to it as quick as we can.
And there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes to get to those orange cones and that construction.
There is. And, you know, that's a great point that you point out is, you know, the work going on behind the scenes. We get Facebook comments all the time. We just hear from citizens, hey, when are you going to do these things? I think it's important to talk about what's happening behind the scenes. Recently, your team put out the survey asking about what roads citizens wanted improved. And I think you and I talked about it. Probably the top 10 roads that came off of that minus one or two are already in that process that we've talked about today. And so it's important for citizens to understand that, and that's why we're talking today, and that's why we're trying to get that out to them. Is, you know, the roads that we heard on that survey were Aspen Street going out towards Indian Springs. We heard Lynn Lane at Washington and the backup at the intersection. We heard which other ones were the main ones?
I think there was some Houston
Street coming in past Olive to Aspen. I think even Houston as you go out to
out east.
51. And the important thing is every single one of those is in the design process. Most of them are in the right-of-way process or utility relocation process. Like, we're moving up, getting closer to construction. But those primary roads that the citizens are saying they want done, everything else, it's in that process. It's getting done. Many of them voted on in 2018, part of that bond. So we're getting there as fast as we can.
Yeah, I noticed you scribbled some notes down there earlier. And are these the roadways that are currently being worked on behind the scenes?
Yeah, so we had talked about a couple of things. One is just what we've completed recently. It's not always, you kind of forget on the ones we've done, but I think since 2018, construction-wise, we've completed approximately 11 miles of construction widenings and since that time period. And more so what we were just talking about, there's about 11 or 12 more miles already in the design process to be completed over the next 2 or 3 years. They're not projects that we're just starting. They're projects that have been in the process, part of that 2018 bond, that we're halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, and we're trying to get closer to construction. But regardless what happens with future funding, future bonds, or anything else, you know, we still got 11 to 12 main arterial miles coming up in road widenings.
And I think it's probably important to point out that we are in the initial stages right now because we're looking ahead to the 2026 general obligation bond, and we have a whole book of proposed ideas for capital improvements that could potentially be put into that into those propositions. And so we're already starting that phase now for projects that we haven't even identified yet that could be improved for later on. And it's likely they wouldn't be improved for another 8 years very similar to the way Houston Street between Garnett and Olive is happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for voters to understand that when they go to the polls to vote. We are completing or getting closer to completing most of the projects that were in that 2018 general obligation bond, but here we are in 2025. And we're talking about in 2026 going back to the voters to ask about the next bond. But in the planning process, again, as we've talked about several times today, these things take time. And so when we're trying to plan what goes in that 2026 bond, we're trying to project out what the cost of these roads will be in 2030, 2031, because that's likely how long it's going to take us to get to construction on those roads. If and when the voters approve that they want these roads constructed and they want to provide the funding to do that, as we've talked about, we'll wait for that funding to come in on an annual basis from the property taxes. And as we get it, we'll start the design and we'll move into that process. But I think it's important when you go to the polls and you go to vote, you understand that, next year you're not going to see those roads under construction. It's going to take several years to get there, but we will get there.
It's been a fun conversation. I appreciate it. It's been an education, if you will, as far as that project life cycle. A lot of work going on behind the scenes that you and your team have to do, and I think we're just like everybody else. We're ready for the construction to be over with just the minute it starts.
Absolutely.
And so it was great. I appreciate the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you behind the wheel and driving BEA and letting us know what's going on with our city streets. So thanks, Charlie.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.